or the cry of a passing seabird. I have been fetched out of bed several times to listen to it, but I need hardly say that I was unable to distinguish anything unnatural. The men, however, are so absurdly positive upon the subject that it is hopeless to argue with them. I mentioned the matter to the captain once, but to my surprise he took it very gravely, and indeed appeared to be considerably disturbed by what I told him. I should have thought that he at least would have been above such vulgar delusions. All of this disposition upon the superstition leads me up to the fact that Mr. Manson, our second mate, saw a ghost last night. Or at least he says he did. Which of course is the same thing. It is quite refreshing to have some new topic of conversation after the eternal routine of bears and whales which has served us for so many months. Manson swears that the ship is haunted, and that he would not stay in her a day if he had any other place to go. Indeed, the fellow is honestly frightened, and I had to give him some chloral and bromide of potassium this morning to steady him down. He seemed quite indignant when I suggested that he had been having an extra glass the night before, and I was obliged to pacify him by keeping as a grave countenance as possible during his story, which he certainly narrated in a very straightforward and matter-of-fact way. "I was on the bridge," he said, "about 4 bells in the middle of watch, just when the night was at its darkest, and there was a bit of a moon, but the clouds were blowing across it so that you couldn't see far from the ship. John MacLeod, our harpooner, he came aft above the forska side and reported a strange noise on the starboard bow. I went forward and we both heard it, sometimes like a bairn crying, and sometimes like a wench in pain. I have been 17 years to the country and never heard a seal, young or old, make a sound like that. As we were standing there at the foresicle head, the moon came out from behind the cloud, and we both saw a sort of white figure moving across the ice field in the same direction that we heard the cries. We lost sight of it for a while, but it came back on the port bow, and we could just make it out like a shadow on the ice. I sent a band aft for the rifles, and MacLeod and I went down onto the pack, thinking that maybe it might be a bear. When we got on the ice, I lost sight of MacLeod, but I pushed on in the direction where I could still hear the cries. I followed them for maybe a mile or more, and then running around the hummock, I came right on top of it, standing and waiting for me, seemingly. I don't know what it was. It wasn't a bear anyway. It was tall and white and straight, and if it wasn't a man nor a woman, I'd stake my davy that it was something worse. I made for the ship as hard as I could run, and precious glad I was able to find myself aboard. I signed articles to do my duty by the ship, and on the ship I'll stay, but you don't catch me on the ice again after sundown." That is his story, given as far as I can in his own words. I fancy that what he saw must, in spite of his denial, have been a young bear, erect upon its hind legs, an attitude which they often assume when alarmed. In the uncertain light, this would bear a resemblance to a human figure, especially to a man whose nerves were already somewhat shaken. Whatever it might have been, the occurrence is unfortunate, for it has produced a most unpleasant effect upon the crew. Their looks are more sullen than before, and their discontent more open. The double grievance of being debarred from the herring fishing and of being detained in what they choose to call a haunted vessel may lead them to do something rash. Even the harpooners, who are the oldest and steadiest among them, are joining in the general agitation. Apart from this absurd outbreak of superstition, things are looking rather more cheerful. The pack which was forming to the south of us has partly cleared away, and the water is so warm as to lead me to believe that we are lying in one of those branches of the Gulf Stream which run up between Greenland and Spitzbergen. There are numerous small medusae and sea lemons about the ship, with an abundance of shrimps, so there is very good possibility of a fish being sighted. Indeed, one was seen blowing about dinner time, but in such a position that it was impossible for the boats to follow it. September 13th. I had an interesting conversation with the chief's mate, Mr. Milne, upon the bridge. It seems that our captain is as great an enigma to the seamen, and even to the owners of the vessel, as he has been to me. Mr. Milne tells me that the ship is paid off upon returning from a voyage. Captain Craigie disappears and is not seen again until the approach of another season, when he walks quietly into the office of the company and asks whether his services will be required. He has no friend in Dundee, nor does anyone pretend to be acquainted with this early history. His position depends entirely upon his skill as a seaman, and his name for courage and coolness, which he had earned in the capacity of a mate before being entrusted with a separate command. The unanimous opinion seems to be that he is not a Scotchman, and that his name is an assumed one. Mr. Milne thinks that he has devoted himself to whaling simply for the reason that it is the most dangerous occupation which he could select, and that he counts death in every possible manner. He mentions several instances of this, one of which is rather curious, if true. It seems that on one occasion he did not put an appearance at the office, and a substitute had to be selected in his place. That was at the last time of the Turkish and Russian War. When he turned up again next spring, he had pluckered a wound on the side of his neck, which he used to endeavor to conceal with his cravat. Whether the mate's inference that he had been engaged in the war is true or not, I cannot say, but it was certainly a strange coincidence. The wind is veering around in an easterly direction, but it is still very slight, and I think the ice is lying closer than it did yesterday. As far as the eye can reach on every side, there is one wide expanse of spotless white, only broken by an occasional rift or the dark shadow of a hummock. To the south, there is a narrow line of blue water, which is our sole mean of escape, and which is closing up every day. The captain is taking a heavy responsibility upon himself. I hear that the tank of potatoes has been finished, and even the biscuits are running short, but he preserves the same impassible countenance and spends a greater part of the day at the crow's nest, sweeping the horizon with his glass. In his manner is very variable, and he seems to avoid my society, but there has been no repetition of the violence which he showed the other night. 7:30 p.m. My deliberate opinion is that we are commanded by a madman. Nothing else can account for the extraordinary vagaries of Captain Craigie. It is very fortunate that I have kept this journal of our voyage, as it will serve to justify us in case we have to put him under any sort of restraint, a step which I should only consent to as a last resource. Curiously enough, it was he himself who suggested lunacy, and not mere eccentricity, on the secret of his strange conduct. He was standing upon the bridge about an hour ago, peering as usual through his glass, while I was walking up and down the quarterdeck. The majority of the men were below at their tea, for the watches have not been regularly kept of late. Tired of walking, I leaned against the bulwarks and admired the mellow glow cast by the sinking sun on the great ice fields which surround us. I was suddenly aroused from the revise into which I had fallen by a hoarse voice at my elbow, and staring around, I found that the captain had descended and was standing by my side. He was staring out over the ice with an expression in which horror, surprise, and something approaching to joy were contending for the mastery. In spite of the cold, great drops of perspiration that were coursing down his forehead, he was evidently fearfully excited. His limbs twitched like those of a man upon the verge of an epileptic fit, and the lines about his mouth were drawn and hard. "Look," he grasped, seizing me by the waist, but still keeping his eyes upon the distant ice, and moving his head slowly in a horizontal direction, as if following some object which was moving across the field of vision. "Look, there, man, there, between the hummocks. Now, coming out from behind the far one. You see her? You must see her. There still, flying by from me. By God, flying from me. And gone." He uttered the last two words in a whisper of concentrated agony which shall never fade from my remembrance. Clinging to the ratlines, he endeavored to climb up on top of the bulwark as if in hope of obtaining a last glance at the departing object. His strength was not equal to the attempt, however, and he staggered back against the saloon skylights, where he leaned, panting and exhausted. His face was so livid that I expected him to become unconscious, so lost no time in leading him down the companion and stretching him upon one of the sofas in the cabin. I then poured out some brandy, which I held to his lips, and which had a wonderful effect upon him, bringing the black blood to his white face and steadying his poor shaking limbs. He raised himself up upon his elbow, and looking round to see that we were alone, he beckoned me to come close and sit beside him. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, still in the same subdued, awesome tone so foreign to the nature of the man. "No, I saw nothing." His head sank back against the cushions. "No, he wouldn't without the glass," he murmured. "He couldn't. It was the glass that showed her to me. And then the eyes of love. The eyes of love. I say, Doc, don't let the steward in! He'll think I'm mad. Just bolt the door, will you?" I rose and did as he had commanded. He lay quiet for a little, lost in thought apparently, and then raised himself up upon his elbow again and asked for some more brandy. "You don't think I am mad, do you, Doc?" he asked, as I was putting the bottle back into the after locker. "Tell me now, as man to man, do you think I am mad?" "I think you have something on your mind," I answered, "which is exciting you and doing you a good deal of harm." "Right there, lad," he cried, his eyes sparkling from the effects of the brandy. "Plenty on my mind, plenty. But I can work out the latitude and the longitude. I can handle my sextant and I can manage my logarithms. You couldn't prove me mad in a court of law, could you now?" It was curious to hear the man lying back and coolly arguing out the question of his own sanity. "Perhaps not," I said. "But still, I think you would be wise to get home as soon as you can and settle down to a quiet life for a while." "Get home, eh?" he muttered, with a sneer upon his face. "One word for me and two for yourself, lad. Settle down with Flora, pretty little Flora. Our bad dreams, signs of madness." "Sometimes," I murmured. "What else? What would be the first symptoms?" "Pains in the head, noises in the ears, flashes before the eyes, delusions."
"Ah, what about them?" he interrupted. "What would you call a delusion?"
"Seeing things that are not there is a delusion."
"But she was there," he groaned to himself. "She was there."
And rising, he unbolted the door and walked with a slow and uncertain